12 years of hauling bodies from the depths had inured me to the heartbreak, even the unexplainable. But this was different. This job, it breeds a special kind of despair. A missing person in the woods might be found alive after days, but when we get the call, it's almost always a recovery. People don't last long in the water, especially not here in the north, a land of brutal winters and rivers that run as cold and unforgiving as its people. We pulled more deer carcasses from the river than living souls, and a missing kid. That was just a preemptive condolence call to the family. Our little town had the highest per capita drowning rate in the country, but we still searched, and we usually found them. I'd thought about quitting plenty of times. Most guys did after their first recovery. They warned us in training about the grotesque distortion of waterlogged corpses, but nothing prepares you for the abject horror of it. Many a diver never touched the water again after seeing that. But I kept at it, year after year. Figured if I didn't, no one would. What I saw last week, though, made me rethink everything. A father took his 10-year-old son fishing. He snagged his finger on a hook and went back to the car for the first aid kit. When he returned minutes later, the boy was gone. My heart sank as I listened to the story. It had been raining relentlessly for the better part of a month, swelling the river to a raging torrent. The weather had taken an unseasonably cold turn. There had been a string of disappearances in recent weeks, most still unaccounted for. I held out little hope of finding the boy alive. We reached the scene within the hour, a larger search and rescue team already on its way. We spoke to the father, scoured the woods for a bit, hoping against hope the boy had merely wandered off. But eventually, we were forced to begin searching the river. The moment I touched the water, I knew the boy was gone. The current was the strongest I'd ever felt. Even I struggled to keep my footing in the frigid river. We searched for hours, expanding our perimeter as the larger team arrived. Still no sign of the boy. I was surprised. I hadn't expected to find the boy alive, but I'd at least expected to find a body. The sun began to set, the air growing colder. We were discussing calling it a night and resuming the search in the morning when I noticed something. There were numerous creek beds that crisscrossed around the river. Many had long since dried up, overtaken by vegetation or diverted by man. We usually didn't pay them much mind. However, with all the recent rain, I noticed that one of the larger ones had begun flowing again. It was dumping enough water to easily sweep a young boy away. The creek cut across a bend in the river, connecting at 2 points. I followed it, realizing that the boy could be outside our initial search area. As I neared where the creek rejoined the main river, a sense of unease settled over me. There was a stretch of the river that even the rescue divers weren't allowed to go near. We called it bad water. This section ran along one bank of the river, about 100 yards long. It was near a particularly dense patch of vegetation, so we didn't usually have to worry about people swimming there. But there had been a disturbing number of disappearances in the surrounding area. Still, I'd been warned away from ever diving there since I started as a rescue diver. They said the undertow there was so strong that it would pull even the strongest swimmers under in an instant. Don't go near bad water. It was a mantra amongst the old-timers. The creek emptied directly into the middle of bad water. When I reached the spot, I paused, considering. If I went back and reported this to the others, they'd tell me to leave it. They wouldn't let me dive there. But deep down, I felt that the boy's body might be caught in the weeds near there. If only I could find it. I couldn't bear the thought of the child being stuck down there, his body slowly bloating and decomposing while his parents waited for him to come home. Badwater didn't look that bad. I'd seen rougher water, but I knew looks could be deceiving. Just below the surface, the current could be much stronger than I imagined, and I'd be pulled under in an instant. What's more, I wasn't supposed to dive alone. I almost turned back, but something drew me forward. I stared into the river for a moment, thinking about the boy. Then I put on my diving gear and plunged into the icy water. The first thing I noticed was that the current was actually quite weak, weaker than the rest of the river, in fact. The water there was incredibly deep, and I could see nothing but blackness below as I descended. I kicked harder, figuring the current must be stronger further down, but if anything, it seemed to lessen. The water was almost eerily still. I continued to descend until, finally, green shape began to coalesce in front of me. I figured I'd finally reached a patch of weeds. But as I swam lower, the truth became horrifyingly clear. I wanted to vomit, a strange and dangerous sensation when you're wearing a diving mask. Countless arms sprouted from the ground. At first, I thought I'd stumbled upon a mass grave, but the truth was far more horrifying. The arms were growing directly out of the ground. They even had roots spreading out from their bases. It was as if someone had chopped off hundreds of arms at the shoulder and planted them there. They were green and sickly, and I could see them swaying gently in the water. They were all different sizes, and it seemed ages. Malformed, child-sized hands sprouted near the bottom, clenching and unclenching greedily. And then I saw the boy. His eyes stared vacantly ahead as several of the grotesque arms pulled his limp body down. It seemed they had only just caught him. The arms pulled, burying him in the sediment around them. They pushed and squirmed and contorted until he was buried up to his chest. I watched in horrified fascination. It was then that I saw the other bodies. There must have been at least 4 more, all in various states of decomposition. Some were so bloated that they were unrecognizable, just massive white masses protruding from the riverbed. I gagged again, trying to force it back down. The damned hands were feeding on the bodies, using them as fertilizer. I ripped my mask off and vomited the moment I climbed out of the water. I couldn't stop thinking about those ghastly bodies, the grasping hands. They were like some kind of carnivorous plant, but in the shape of human appendages. I retched again at the thought. I practically sprinted back to camp and pulled one of the other divers aside. Moose was the most experienced in our group. He'd been diving for over 20 years, ever since he moved here. I told him everything I'd seen. When I finished, he just looked at me in silence. I told you not to go near Badwater. His voice was flat. Even his thick Louisiana drawl couldn't mask the coldness. That's what you're worried about? I couldn't believe it. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong. Don't tell anyone else about this. If the others found out you went to Badwater. He trailed off, thinking for a moment. Well, it wouldn't be good. He shook his head like a disappointed father. But what about those things? I tried to keep my voice down, hoping no one else could hear us. How many people have died because of those damn things? Quiet down, Moose said. We have an agreement. There's a reason why they only grow in Badwater. Don't go messing this up. I started to say something, but my throat closed up. He was keeping something from me. He sighed, and I saw a flicker of sadness in his eyes. Sometimes you gotta choose the lesser of two evils. Even the best decisions can keep you up at night. He was silent for a moment, just looking at me. Don't tell anyone about this. Maybe someday you'll understand. He walked off after that, and they called off the search for the day. Despite what I told him, we continued searching for the next 2 days. By the third day, we gave up completely and sent our condolences to the family. I didn't know what the hell was going on. Moose had been acting differently around me ever since. He was cold and distant, but every now and then he'd give me this knowing look, like we were sharing some dark secret. I'd caught the other senior divers acting strangely too. What did he mean when he said agreement? What were those arm things? I was considering quitting my job and leaving. I couldn't live with the thought of those things being down there, slowly feasting on the corpse of a young boy and countless others. I wanted to forget what I'd seen, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't erase those images from my mind. I like to think I was a good man, but there's a point where abject horror overwhelms a person's conscience, no matter how good you are. I think I'd reached that point. I wasn't going to post about this, but things have happened, and I've discovered something horrifying. There's no other way to explain it. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. I haven't been able to sleep. I keep having these dreams about the damn things I saw. I've been plagued by nightmares about them for the past 2 nights. It always feels so real. First I'm in bed. Then suddenly those arms are sprouting from the shadows around me, pinning me down, covering my mouth. I struggle, but they're too strong. I remember that god-awful smell in particular. It was like cut grass and rotting fish all mixed together. The next thing I know, I'm waking up, gasping for air with tears streaming down my face. However, even those horrible dreams are nothing compared to what's happened the last 2 days, especially not compared to what I saw last night. I don't know what to make of it. I've already packed my things. I think I'm leaving soon. I need to get out of this god-forsaken town. A few days ago, not long after my first post, I got a call about a body being found near the river. My blood ran cold when I arrived and realized that it had been found right near where the boy had disappeared. I approached the riverbank and saw Moose and 2 others standing over a body. Their backs were to me, and I could hear one of them speaking in hushed, angry tones. Damn it, damn it, damn it. That was Clyde, one of the other seasoned SR divers. As I got closer, I saw the other was Ryan. A chill ran down my spine. All 3 senior divers were in the same place. I remembered what Moose had said to me last week, as well as the knowing looks I'd seen the 3 of them exchange. Something was going on. You think he's the one? Clyde asked. Don't jump to conclusions, Moose said. I heard it talking by the river last night, Ryan said suddenly. The other 2 fell silent and stared at him. Lures? Clyde asked. His voice was so low I could barely hear him. Ryan nodded. Almost certainly. But that violates the agreement, Clyde said. He isn't supposed to use those anymore. Well, he is, so what's that tell you? Ryan turned to Moose. You know what's going on, right? Moose started to respond when a twig snapped under my foot. The 3 older men whirled around to face me. The coldness was still there in Moose's eyes, but I also detected a hint of fear. You're late, Clyde said from beside him, seemingly unaware that I'd been standing there for a moment. We got bad news. He stepped aside so I could get a better look at the body. My blood turned to ice the moment I saw it. I was still reeling from the conversation I'd just eavesdropped on, and the sight of the body only added to my confusion. It was Michael, one of the newer search and rescue divers. He was lying face up in full diving gear, except for his mask. I walked forward and knelt beside the body. Michael was new to search and rescue, and he'd actually sat in on a couple of classes I'd taught. I felt tears welling up as I looked down at him. What the hell had happened? As if to answer my unspoken question, Moose spoke up. Found him face down in the river for some reason. We figure he must have gotten caught in a strong current and slammed his face against a rock, knocking his regulator loose and causing him to drown. We haven't been able to find his regulator or mask anywhere. I continued to stare at the dead man before me. Why was he even in the water? I asked. The three men exchanged glances. We don't know, Clyde said. We figure he might have been looking for that boy we never found. I knew they were lying. Michael was one of the most by-the-book divers I'd ever met. He would never violate a minor safety regulation, let alone go diving alone in dangerous waters. It was absurd. Besides, there was another reason why their assertion didn't make sense. Michael had been out of town visiting family the day the boy went missing. Why would he come back if he wasn't even present for the initial search? He wouldn't even know where to look. I knew better than to argue. I didn't want them to know I suspected anything. Clyde and Ryan had no idea I'd been to Badwater, assuming Moose kept his secret. As far as I could tell, he had. They acted the same as they always had around me. Just then, an ambulance pulled up. The others left me alone with Michael's body while they spoke with the driver. As I looked at the body, I realized something was off. There weren't any bruises on his face. If the current had really slammed him into a rock, there should have been at least some bruising. But there was nothing. His face was completely unmarked. It was then that I noticed something odd. A single purple bruise protruded from beneath his diving collar. I pulled the rubber down to reveal a massive black and purple bruise that encircled his entire neck. It looked as if he had been strangled. My mind immediately went to the strange, hand-like things I'd seen in Badwater. But if that was what had killed him, why release his body? Was this a warning? A deep, primal fear welled up in the pit of my stomach at that moment, and it's only gotten worse since then. After the ambulance took Michael's body away, I went home feeling drained. I couldn't bring myself to do anything that day and just sat in chilly silence. I didn't sleep well that night, plagued by the nightmares I mentioned before. Most of yesterday was spent in the same cold silence as the day before. I felt numb. The conversation I'd overheard between the senior divers played over and over in my head. What did they mean when they said lures? Who was the he they kept referring to? I remembered what Ryan had said about hearing it talking near the river. Those were almost certainly the lures they had mentioned. As I sat there, my numbness evaporated and was replaced by anger. Michael was dead, and it had something to do with Moose and his secrets. It probably had something to do with those lures as well. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door. I was going to see what Ryan meant when he said he heard it talking. I wish I hadn't gone. I should have just stayed home and let it go. There are some things in this world that are better left buried in the darkness. I wandered along the riverbank for 30 minutes, hearing nothing but the sounds of nocturnal animals. I was about to turn back when I heard something in the distance. It sounded like someone's voice. The sound grew louder as I made my way up the bank until I could finally make out what it was saying. "Help me. Please, I can't swim." Instinct took over. and I broke into a run, following the sound downstream. I eventually strayed from the path and found myself stumbling through the underbrush, barely using my flashlight and relying only on my hearing. Eventually, the voice was coming from just over the water beside me. It sounded like a child. I was about to wade into the river when something stopped me. I listened closely to the voice. "Help me, please. I can't swim." They were the exact same words, repeated over and over again, as if it were being played on repeat. The inflection was even the same each time. It sounded wrong. They were screaming, but it wasn't like someone who was actually afraid. There was no urgency in their voice. My heart pounding in my chest, I shined my flashlight along the river. That's when I saw it. A face protruded from the mud along the riverbank. Like the hands I'd seen, it was a sickly green color, with roots sprouting from its jawline and anchoring into the surrounding earth. It was as if someone had crafted a human head from algae or moss. The mouth opened and closed, repeating the same plea for help, while the rest of the face remained slack and emotionless. I trembled as I stared at the thing. Just behind it, beneath the water, I saw two of those hands reaching up from the shallows, grasping at nothing. A chilling thought occurred to me. Michael must have heard the thing's cries for help and immediately suited up in his diving gear, only to wade in and be pulled down by those hands. This was what Ryan meant when he said he heard it talking. I felt sick to my stomach as I watched the grotesque face continue to call out. The cries grew fainter and further between until the face was completely silent. Then, without warning, it retreated into the earth, burying itself in a thin layer of mud. I shuddered, thinking about how it was right there, just beneath the surface. Then I realized that there might be more of them. Who knew how many of them were lurking just beneath me? I sprinted back to my car, disgust fueling me more than fear. When I got home, I sat up all night, thinking about what I'd seen. I finally got a few hours of sleep right before the sun rose, but was awoken by the nightmares once again. I don't know what to do anymore. There are twisted, unnatural things happening here, and even if I had the power to stop them, I don't think I want to face this darkness alone. It feels like a giant puzzle, and I'm missing a crucial piece or two to connect everything together. I've packed my essentials into my bag, now sitting by the front door. I think I'm leaving. The problem is, I don't know where I'd go. I have no family outside of this town, and I haven't exactly been frugal with my savings. Still, a part of me feels obligated to stay, out of morbid curiosity and because I owe it to Michael. Hell, not just Michael. I owe it to countless people who may have fallen victim to those things in the river. Isn't that why I took this job in the first place? I have a lot to think about. If this is my last post, know that I moved on and never looked back. If I continue this investigation, I'll try to keep you all updated. As long as those damned hands don't get me first, despite everything that's happened, I've decided to stay. To be honest, I fully intended to leave as soon as possible after my last post. But that changed when I went to Michael's funeral. It was a somber experience. He was only 22. His girlfriend cried the entire time, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as I watched his young friends carry the casket to its final resting place. His death never should have happened. I had the dream again last night. This time was the worst. Like before, the hands reached up from the darkness, grabbing me, covering my mouth, pinning my arms down to the bed. That putrid smell filled my nostrils, and my eyes began to water as I struggled against them. Then, 2 more hands sprouted and pried my eyes open. I watched in terror as a face slowly emerged from the ceiling above me. It was just like the face I'd seen beneath the water, all green and mossy. Tears began to stream down my face as I recognized the features. It was Michael. "Why would you do this?" he said, a cold, black liquid dripping from his mouth. I tried to respond, but couldn't get past the hands clamped over my face. Why? Michael said over and over again, his voice growing more and more distorted with each repetition. I lay there for what felt like hours as he stared down at me, demanding to know why I would do this to him. I woke up in a cold sweat and could have sworn that the same disgusting smell still lingered in my room. I'm beginning to think this is all my fault. I should have heeded the warnings about bad water. I don't think I was the first one to ever go there, but I was the first one to see the truth of it and return alive. Bad water wasn't only famous among the divers. There were plenty of local legends about that stretch of the river, and thinking back, I vaguely remember hearing something about hands that pull people down to a watery grave. Growing up, kids would spread rumors and folk tales about bad water and the river as a whole. As I got older, I assumed they were just stories adults made up to keep us away from dangerous rapids. I started looking into the history of our town. The legends were incredibly old, and even the indigenous people told stories about the river, regarding it with a certain fearful reverence. I found a strangely familiar description in a Native American creation myth about the river. It was in the library archives as part of a thesis by a local university professor regarding allegorical folklore. The myth told the story of a young man who lived by the river. He had everything he could ever want: a beautiful wife, a son, bountiful harvests, and a warm place to sleep. However, this all changed when he contracted a terrible illness. The illness spread to his wife and child. He recovered, but his family did not, and he was left alone. He still had a warm bed at night and healthy crops, but he fell into a deep depression. Not knowing what to do with himself, he wandered along the riverbank for hours on end, silently wishing that he would one day fall in and be swept away from his troubles. One day, while walking along the banks, he heard his wife and child calling his name. Panicked, he searched everywhere for the source of the voices. They began to tell him that they were happy, living beneath the river. His family urged him to jump in and join them so that he too could be happy. Without thinking, he jumped in and drowned, cold and alone. The man who studied that myth believed it was a warning against yearning for what we've lost and getting caught up in the past. Now, I know this isn't true. The myth was a true story and a warning to all people against the dangers of the things that lived in the river. Upon further research, I discovered that there were actually numerous indigenous legends about the river. Many of them were similar to the one I just told you about. But there were others that made the entire situation seem much more complex. Many of them mentioned some kind of river spirit or entity that the indigenous people worshipped. There were a few different translations, but the most common one I saw was Moss King. Some stories made it sound like they sacrificed people to him to quell his wrath, while others described a situation where he was to be left alone in exchange for not actively harming people. I couldn't help but think about the agreement that Moose and the others had mentioned. Could they be referring to a similar agreement like this one? I didn't know about this whole Moss King mythology, but after everything I'd seen, I was almost ready to believe anything. Later, I got the idea to chart out all the disappearances and deaths that had occurred over the past several decades. What I found was fairly typical. Most of the reports were clustered around the most dangerous areas of the river, as well as places where people tended to congregate. However, I noticed a disturbing trend. The reports with no body recovered happened almost exclusively in the areas surrounding Badwater from when the report started. In those areas, only about 15% of cases ever recovered a body. This was usually attributed to the strong currents there, which supposedly swept them too far away to be found. But now, I knew the truth. The hands had taken those people and pulled them down to be consumed. However, while doing this, I noticed something even more intriguing. I had been using several different maps to chart the disappearances when I realized that there was a discrepancy between two of the maps. Curious, I looked over a few more maps and saw even more discrepancies. They were all relatively similar, except for a few changes due to dried-up creeks and urbanization. However, there was an area deep in the woods west of Badwater that didn't seem to match up on any of the maps. Some of them just showed woods there, while others showed a small lake. A few of the older maps even depicted a cave system. I used Google Earth to look at the area, but something strange happened. The image was incredibly blurry. Everything around it was clear, but it became pixelated the moment I moved over the area where the maps were inconsistent. It was still somewhat visible, but I could barely make out anything other than trees. I was surprised, as I'd never been there before. I spent a lot of time wandering those woods, and how had I never stumbled upon this place? I was going to check it out soon. I had a feeling this mystery went much deeper than Moose and his group. There was more to this, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. Wish me luck, and if I don't come back, well, just wish me luck. Damn it, I screwed up. After discovering that strange area on the maps, I decided to head out there. I packed everything I thought I might need: hiking gear, a camera to document my findings, emergency flares, and a gun. I wasn't going to be caught off guard. By then, I was determined to get to the bottom of our town's strange mystery. I set out around mid-morning, figuring it would be best to explore during the day. I didn't want anything to do with whatever came near the river at night. The lures, as Clyde had called them. Speaking of which, there had been 3 more disappearances in the last few nights. I had no doubt that it was because of those grotesque faces. The other SER divers had been searching tirelessly, but I'd called in sick each day. I didn't want anything to do with Moose and his group until I figured out what was going on. I felt a little guilty about it, but I hoped that my investigation would save more lives in the long run. I made my way toward the strange area I'd discovered, choosing to move through the thickest part of the woods to avoid running into anyone. The hike was surprisingly long and arduous. I could barely find my footing after all the rain we'd been having. Within 15 minutes, I was soaked, covered in mud, and had nearly ruined my camera. The trek took a very long time, much longer than I had anticipated. It was as if I were walking in a circle around the area, never getting any closer. I checked my phone. I had been using it to navigate, but somehow I kept getting turned around. My destination should have been directly east of me, no more than a mile away. I turned back in that direction and walked straight, but when I checked my phone, I realized that I had somehow veered north. I was getting closer to my destination, but also moving further away at the same time. I didn't know how to explain it. I just kept getting turned around without consciously trying to. This went on for hours, and I worried that the sun would set before I got there. But I was getting closer, bit by bit, until finally I came to a clearing. The sight that greeted me stopped me in my tracks. A towering stone structure stood in the middle of a large clearing. It was difficult to explain the structure. Imagine you cut off the top 500 feet of a mountain peak and placed it down in the middle of a field. It looked just like that, a disconnected stone structure that rose to a jagged, uneven peak. It gave a distinct impression of a pyramid, although it lacked the smoothness and straight edges one would expect. A crevice in the front seemed to lead inside to a passage. Strangest of all, a small river was flowing out of the mouth of the cave. It was only about 10 feet wide and snaked through the clearing until it split off into the woods. The water was clear and surprisingly fast-moving. I followed the river until I reached the mouth of the cave. I peered inside and saw only darkness, the passage so deep I couldn't see the end. It seemed relatively straight, with no branching tunnels. I stepped inside the cave and noticed that the air immediately became colder. The temperature must have dropped at least 10 degrees from the outside. I shivered and zipped my jacket up. The river continued as far as the passage went, and I followed it as I delved deeper into the strange mountain. I noticed that there were no stalactites or stalagmites in the cave. While it lacked the smoothness or markings that would suggest it was a man-made tunnel, it didn't seem natural either. The entire place gave off a strange vibe. I continued deeper until I was certain that I was in the center of the structure. It was then that I noticed a strange, faint green glow in the distance. It grew closer and brighter until I almost didn't need my flashlight. The passage narrowed until I was practically tiptoeing around the edge of the river. The light flared until suddenly I found myself in a massive circular cavern. The walls were covered in thousands upon thousands of tiny glowing green insects. Fireflies. I had heard of caves like this in New Zealand, but never thought they existed here. However, it was what lay in the center of the cavern that drew my attention. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it, and my hand immediately went to my gun. The river narrowed until it terminated in a circular pool of clear water. In the center of that pool was a massive stone throne that looked as if it had been carved directly from the cavern floor. It was decorated with beads, reflective stones, and precious metals. Ordinarily, I might have found it beautiful, but its beauty was ruined by what sat upon it. I could only describe it as humanoid. It was at least 14 feet tall and sat upright, almost regally, atop the throne. Its hands rested on the throne's armrests, and a crown of stone sat upon its head. The body was made of a deep green moss, just like the face I'd seen by the riverbank. Black stones sat where its eyes should have been, and they stared down the length of the tunnel I had just walked through. I shuddered, thinking about how that thing had been watching me the entire time I approached it. There was no doubt in my mind. That was what the indigenous people called the Moss King. That was when I noticed the smell. It was awful, and I couldn't believe I hadn't noticed it sooner. It was exactly like the smell in my dream, a sickening combination of cut grass and rotting fish. I nearly vomited and tried to focus on breathing through my mouth. It didn't help much, though. I could taste it in the air. It coated my tongue and throat, making it impossible to ignore. I covered my mouth and nose with one hand, while the other brought my camera up. This had to be the source of all the strange happenings. This was what the indigenous myths had spoken of, and I was going to make sure everyone knew about it. I turned the camera on, pointed it at the green humanoid, and nothing. The image was too blurry to make out anything, just a jumbled mess of black and green shapes on the screen. I wiped the lens on my shirt and turned back to the throne, only to see that it was still the same. I couldn't get it to focus properly. I was about to clean the lens again when I heard a voice behind me. "It won't work." I spun around and saw Moose standing there. He looked at me, weariness in his eyes. "He has a way of hiding himself," Moose said, nodding his head towards the humanoid on the throne. "Cameras won't work, neither will film. Hell, it's a miracle you even found this place. Most people just get lost." I slowly moved my hand toward my gun. He noticed the movement and held his hands up in surrender. "Whoa now," he said. "I'm not here to hurt you." "Right," I said. Moose sighed. "Look, you go ahead and hold on to that gun if it makes you feel better. You can even point it at me if it makes you feel better. Just hear me out, and promise you won't shoot me for no reason." I kept my hand on the gun at my hip, but nodded. "You're not going to believe me when I tell you this, but I tried to protect you." Moose lowered himself to the cold stone floor, exhaustion evident in his posture. His normally clean-shaven face now sported a scraggly beard and bags under his bloodshot eyes. "Bullshit. Just like you tried to protect all those people at Badwater?" Moose was silent for a moment, his eyes distant. "You don't know how much I wish I could have." I stared at him for a moment. He genuinely seemed remorseful. There was no malice in his eyes. He was just a tired old man. I kept my hand near my gun, but decided to hear him out. "What is all this, Moose? Why couldn't you save them?" He nodded his head toward the throne again. "You know what that is, right?" "The Moss King." The name felt heavy on my tongue. I felt like I had just spoken something blasphemous. He chuckled humorlessly. "I see you've done your research. Yes, that's what the natives called him, the Moss King. But do you know what he is?" I shook my head slowly. "There are creatures that existed long before man walked this earth, and then there are creatures that existed long before even those." He stared at the Moss King. There was no fear or reverence in his eyes, just tired acceptance. "He's older than almost anything else on this earth. He was ancient when the first fish crawled onto land, older even than the first settlers to set foot in this land. Maybe he's a god, or maybe he's just another creature like us. All I know is he has power beyond measure." "You can't kill him?" Moose shook his head. "That thing isn't him. I mean, it's a part of him. Maybe something akin to a head. But chopping off the head won't kill something like him. He's the river. He's the groundwater. He's the plant life. He's everything. His influence stretches far beyond the river. He can't be stopped. We can only abide by the agreement." I thought about the agreement I had read about in the indigenous myths, as well as the agreement I overheard the senior divers mention. And what exactly is this agreement? I'm not entirely sure about the reasoning behind it, but the Moss King is, by all accounts, an apathetic creature. He doesn't like to be challenged, even though the things that challenge him never stand a chance. He just likes to sit in silence and feed. Almost 1,000 years ago, he made an agreement with the native people. He would limit his power, restricting it to certain areas of the river and only feeding on those that fell in. In return, the people would not attack him and let him feed in peace. One rule of the agreement was that only a select few would ever be allowed to know of the Moss King's existence, Those people would be tasked with guarding his secret and ensuring the covenant was never broken. They are the protectors. This mantle was passed down from generation to generation, and when the natives left, it was passed down to the settlers. Clyde and Ryan are the current protectors, just like their fathers and grandfathers before them. I was having trouble processing everything he had said. This had been going on for much longer than I had ever imagined. "What about you?" I asked. I knew Moose had moved here when he was in his late 20s. He couldn't be passed down like Clyde and Ryan's. Not long after I moved here, I was hunting in the woods nearby. A storm snuck up on me, the likes of which I'd never seen before or since. Couldn't see a damn thing through the downpour. I was stumbling through those woods, looking for any kind of shelter when I stumbled upon this place. That's when I saw him. He stared at the humanoid figure with revulsion. I told Ryan about it the next day. He and Clyde were going to kill me that night. But then the thing, it spoke to them. It wanted me to be a protector. Apparently something about me caught its eye. He looked at me suddenly. "You broke the agreement when you came back from Badwater alive. I didn't tell Clyde or Ryan because I knew they would kill you, but the Moss King knows, and he's pissed. That's why he started using lures again. It's a warning." "What can we do?" I asked. Moose looked at me and sighed. "You really don't get it, do you?" "Get what?" It took me a while to realize it, too. He pointed back towards the throne. "He can talk to us. It's like a voice in our heads, but not words exactly. I can't really explain it." I glanced back at the creature on the throne and shuddered at the thought of it speaking inside my head. "Okay, so?" "He knows you went to Badwater and he could tell Ryan and Clyde any time." A chill ran down my spine as I realized what he was getting at. "So why hasn't he?" "Those two have no qualms about killing anyone who threatens the agreement. Hell, they proved that just yesterday with Michael." "Michael?" "I'm sure you figured out that the hands got him, or maybe the lures drew him in. That's what the others have insinuated to me, although I doubt it. He overheard us talking about the missing boy a few nights ago. Needless to say, some of what he heard was incriminating. I have no doubt that Ryan or Clyde killed him and made it look like a drowning. If Badwater took him, his body would have never been found. They killed him." I was in shock. I knew there was something sinister going on, and the older divers were willfully ignorant of the threat posed by Badwater, but I couldn't believe they would actually murder another diver. "Yes," Moose said, "and they'd kill you too if they knew you'd seen Badwater. So the question is, why hasn't the Moss King told them about you?" I thought back to what he told me about how he started working to uphold the agreement, how Clyde and Ryan tried to kill him, but the Moss King stopped them. "He wants me," I said. Moose nodded. "He wants you to uphold the agreement." He smirked. "I think he has a thing for divers." Suddenly I felt like the massive green humanoid on the throne was staring directly at me. It hadn't moved, but I still felt like I was being watched. That thing wanted me. My fists clenched. I would never work for it. "Help me kill it," I said to Moose, "or at least help me escape." Moose shook his head. "I can't." "Yes, you can. There's still good in you." "You don't understand." He stood up and looked at me with an expression of utter defeat. "I literally can't." He began taking off his shirt. Confused by his actions, I tightened my grip on my gun. However, my hand fell limp when I saw what lay beneath his shirt. A green mass sat in the middle of his chest. Mossy green veins radiated out from it in all directions, fading into his skin. It pulsed rhythmically, like a second heart, and my stomach churned as I saw his skin stretch around it. What the hell is that? It's his mark, Moose said. It's how he shows that I'm his, and it's how he controls me. I can't act against his will. It burns if I do, and it'll kill me if I defy him outright. It's been throbbing in pain ever since I found out you went to Badwater, and I can't even leave town. It'll kill me if I go too far. What the hell, what the hell, what the hell? I backed away from Moose, mumbling to myself. Things had just gotten so much weirder. I pulled out my gun and pointed it at him. Go ahead, he said. I don't care anymore. My hand trembled as I placed my finger on the trigger. I stared at him for what felt like an eternity before finally lowering the gun. I couldn't do it. I'm leaving right now. The words sounded hollow. I had been shaken to my core at that point. Moose shrugged. Suit yourself. You can't escape, though. This all ends one way or another. I ran out of that cave after that, and when I got outside, I kept running. I tripped and stumbled through the woods in a panic. It's a miracle I didn't seriously hurt myself. I ran until I reached my car and sped home. This will probably be my last post for a while. I'm getting out of here tonight. I've got my essentials packed, and I don't care where I go. Anywhere is better than this. I don't know what the Moss King has planned for me. If he's as powerful as Moose says, he might have some way of stopping me from leaving. I don't know anymore. God, I'm scared. Wish me luck. Goodbye, everyone. This will be my last post. Things have gotten to be too much. I'm so sorry. After posting the last entry, I grabbed my bags and threw them in my car. I was leaving. I didn't really have anywhere to go. No family, few friends, and a dwindling bank account. I had nothing but this town. But anywhere was better than what I witnessed in that cave. I didn't care if I had to be homeless or sleep in my car. I was sure I could find work somewhere. Anywhere but here. I immediately got into the driver's seat and headed south. I drove straight, no real destination in mind. I just wanted to get away from here as quickly as possible. However, as I neared the city limits, I began to feel a sharp pain in my chest. The further away from town I got, the more the pain increased in intensity. It was as if something heavy was sitting on my chest and lungs. My breathing became labored, and the pain even traveled down my arms. For a moment, I thought I was having a heart attack. But then I remembered the thing that was inside Moose's chest. I pulled over to the side of the road. By that point, it wasn't just a sharp pain anymore. It felt like someone was repeatedly hitting my chest with a sledgehammer, and my entire body burned with an excruciating, all-consuming pain. I could barely breathe, and my legs were shaking uncontrollably. I pulled up my shirt and looked at my chest. The skin in the center bulged and turned green, dark veins radiating out from it. I watched it pulse slightly, just enough to notice. It was the source of the pain. My breath caught in my throat, and I began to cry. I don't know how long I cried. I must have been on the side of the road for at least 30 minutes, just a trembling, sobbing mess. It was all too much. The sudden appearance of that thing in my chest combined with debilitating pain I was experiencing. After a while, I regained my composure and got back into my car, determined to get away from this thing. But the pain only increased until my vision began to fade. I kept driving even though I could barely see. However, after a while, I couldn't see at all. I couldn't even drive anymore. I got out of my car and started walking, determined to just blindly stumble south. But my legs gave out soon after, and I collapsed on the hard asphalt in a pathetic heap. The pain was too much to bear. I crawled back to my car and turned around, heading back to town. As I did, the pain subsided until it was completely gone. At that moment, I knew that I was his. There was no denying it. I don't know when it happened. Maybe it started when I entered that cave, or maybe it's been slowly occurring all along. It didn't really matter in the end. It's been over a week since then. I've spent most of that time alternating between being a sobbing mess and falling into catatonic states. It's all just too much. I'm sitting in my house now, writing these words. It hurts to even do this. Acting against him, even writing about him, brings back the pain, but his hold over me isn't as strong as the others. At least, not yet. I'm writing this because I feel like I have to. The truth needs to be known, even though I feel like nothing can be done about it. I've come to realize a few things these past few days. I can feel myself getting closer to him, becoming one with his mind. Maybe the agreement wasn't so bad, but I know now that he wouldn't be satisfied with the agreement. Moose was wrong about all that, although I'm sure he must be feeling the truth by now. The king was never complacent. He was merely resting, and the agreement was a method to sustain himself with ease until it was time for him to rise. That time is now. I can feel his cold rage and his unfathomable hunger. I fear for what will happen to this town and the surrounding areas. I don't know how far his influence spreads, but if Moose was telling the truth, he might be unstoppable. As he awakens, I can feel him becoming more and more sentient in my mind. It's strange, like a second thought process constantly lurking beneath the first. I fear he will soon take me over entirely. I don't intend to let that happen. I will not let myself become a mindless slave to this monstrous being. The thing on my chest has started to look just like the one that was on Moose. I've tried cutting it out, but he won't let me. The knife stops a few inches from my skin, and no matter how hard I try, I can't bring my hand any closer. He's a part of me now, forever. I fear there's nothing I can do to remove myself from him. It won't be long before we are one. I have my gun beside me. I'm going to end it. Thank you all so much for listening. I truly appreciate you taking the time to hear my story. If you found this chilling tale captivating, please consider subscribing to my channel for more spine-tingling narratives and unsettling discoveries. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on future uploads. Stay safe out there, and be wary of the waters you swim in. Good night.